The silence of Montana's Bitterroot Valley shattered as wind screamed through the pines, bringing with it the season's deadliest storm. Through the darkness, a lone figure emerged. A wild horse, its coat encrusted with ice, its legs trembling. Beneath the weight of exhaustion, the animal's breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the frigid air as it stumbled through snow drifts that reached its chest. This wasn't just any winter storm. It was nature's fury unleashed, and somewhere in the whiteout, a desperate creature searched for salvation. Thomas Mitchell stood at his farmhouse window, watching the thermometer plummet past zero. The weather service had warned this would be the worst storm to hit Pine Creek Ranch in 50 years, but nothing could have prepared him for the sheer force of the blizzard that now engulfed his family's century-old property. His wife Emma huddled near the fireplace with their children, Lucy and James, all of them listening to the wind's haunting howl. "Dad!" Lucy's voice cut through the storm's roar. "There's something out there!" The 12-year-old pressed her, face against the frosted glass, her breath creating small clouds on the window pane. Tom squinted through the swirling snow, his heart stopping as he caught glimpse of a dark shape moving through the white chaos. The horse appeared like a ghost in the storm, its wild eyes reflecting the dim light from their windows. Its sides heaved with each labored breath, steam rising from its trembling body. But what struck Tom wasn't just the animal's desperate state. It was the look in its eyes. In all his years of ranching, he'd never seen such a raw plea for help in a wild creature's gaze. Emma moved to her husband's side, her hand gripping his arm. "Tom, we can't leave it out there." Her voice carried the weight of someone who knew exactly what they were asking. Their barn was already full with their own horses, and taking in a wild animal during the storm of the century wasn't just risky, it could be dangerous. Lucy and James crowded around their parents, their young faces etched with concern. "Please, Dad," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind's howl. "It's going to die out there." Tom Mitchell had always prided himself on being practical, on making the tough decisions that keeping a ranch alive required. But as he watched the horse struggle against the merciless storm, something deeper than practicality stirred within him. The animal had found its way to their home for a reason, and in that moment, looking into those desperate eyes, Tom knew his family's decision would change more than just one life forever. "Get my coat," he said finally, his voice firm with resolve. "And Lucy, tell Dr. Stewart we're going to need her if we can get her here through this storm." As Tom prepared to step out into the blizzard, he couldn't have known that this moment would mark the beginning of an extraordinary journey, one that would test not just his courage, but the very bonds that held his family together. The storm raged on, but within its fury, a story of hope was about to unfold at Pine Creek Ranch. The thermometer outside their window cracked under the pressure of the falling temperature, but Tom barely noticed as he pulled on his heaviest winter gear. Emma helped him layer up, her hands steady, but her eyes betraying her fear. "Be careful out there," she whispered, adjusting his scarf. "That horse looks wild, and in this weather—" "I know," Tom nodded, understanding the unspoken dangers. Wild horses were unpredictable at the best of times, let alone when they were desperate and afraid. But something about this one was different. There was an intelligence in its eyes that spoke of more than just animal instinct. Lucy rushed back into the room, her cell phone clutched in her trembling hands. "Dr. Stewart says she'll try to make it, but the roads are nearly impassable. She's going to attempt to come through Thompson Trail." Tom's stomach tightened at the news. Thompson Trail was treacherous even in good weather, winding through the mountains like a snake. In this storm, it would be nearly suicidal to attempt, but Rachel Stewart wasn't known for backing down when an animal needed her help. James appeared with Tom's sturdiest rope, his small face serious with responsibility. "Here, Dad, don't forget this." The 9-year-old's voice wavered slightly, but his eyes showed the same determination Tom felt burning in his own chest. The horse's cries grew more desperate outside, barely audible above the storm's fury. Tom knew they were running out of time. He grabbed the rope from James and headed for the door, but Emma's voice stopped him. "Wait," she said, rushing to the kitchen. She returned with a thermos of hot coffee and some sugar cubes she'd been saving for Lucy's riding lessons. "You might need these, for both of you." Tom managed a small smile, touched by his wife's thoughtfulness, even in crisis. He took one last look at his family, Emma's worried face, Lucy's hopeful eyes, James's brave attempt at a smile, before opening the door and stepping into nature's fury. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath away. The wind howled around him, driving ice crystals into any exposed skin with savage force. Through the whiteout conditions, he could barely make out the dark shape of the horse, now huddled against their old oak tree. As Tom approached, moving slowly, through snow that reached past his knees, he began talking softly, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "Easy there, friend. I'm here to help." The horse's head snapped up, its ears swiveling toward his voice. In the dim light filtering from the house windows, Tom could see the animal more clearly now. It was a stallion, probably around 7 or 8 years old, with a coat that might have been dark bay under the crust of ice and snow. Despite its exhausted state, there was something regal about its bearing, a proud arch to its neck that spoke of its wild heritage. But it was the eyes that held Tom transfixed, deep, intelligent eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. The horse watched Tom's approach with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Its sides heaved with each breath, and Tom could see it trembling violently. Without shelter, the animal wouldn't survive another hour in these conditions. Tom stopped, about 10 feet away, slowly reaching into his pocket for the sugar cubes Emma had given him. The horse's nostrils flared, catching the sweet scent even through the bitter wind. "That's it," Tom murmured, taking another careful step forward. "Let's get you somewhere warm." Behind him, through the curtain of snow, he could hear the barn, door creaking as Emma and Lucy prepared a stall. They'd have to clear out their tack room, but it was the only space available. James would be in the house, watching through the window, probably keeping an eye out for Dr. Stewart's truck on the road. The stallion took a shaky step toward Tom, drawn by the promise of sugar and perhaps recognizing help in its hour of need. But just as Tom thought they were making progress, a massive gust of wind tore through the ranch, bringing with it a sound like a freight train. The horse reared in panic, its hooves slicing through the air dangerously close to Tom's head. Tom stumbled backward, losing his footing in the deep snow. As he fell, he caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. More shapes moving through the storm, dark figures emerging from the white chaos. The night was about to become far more complicated than anyone at Pine Creek Ranch could have imagined. If this story touches your heart, remember that compassion can change lives in ways we never expect. Subscribe to see more inspiring tales of hope, courage, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and animals. Leave a like and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that even in the darkest storms, light can be found. Stay tuned for what happens next at Pine Creek Ranch, where one family's decision is about to change everything. The dark shapes materialized through the whiteout, and Tom's heart nearly stopped. 3 more horses emerged from the storm, their bodies covered in ice, moving like spectral figures through the swirling snow. They were wild too, probably from the same herd as the stallion, driven down from the high country by the savage storm. Their appearance changed everything. 1 desperate horse was manageable, but 4. The ranch's resources were already stretched thin. Emma's voice carried faintly through the howling wind. "Tom, the tack room's ready." She couldn't see the new arrivals from her position by the barn, couldn't know that their situation had just become far more complicated. Tom watched as the stallion acknowledged its herdmates, letting out a low, desperate whinny that seemed to carry all the weight of their collective suffering. The wind cut through Tom's layers like knives, and he could feel the cold seeping into his bones. If he was this frozen after just minutes outside, how had these horses survived? The nearest wild herd usually roamed the ridges near Shadow Creek, at least 20 miles away. They must have been fighting through this storm for hours, maybe even days. One of the new arrivals, a young mare with a distinctive white blaze, stumbled and nearly fell. The stallion immediately moved to her side, supporting her with his body despite his own exhaustion. The sight struck something deep in Tom's chest. These weren't just random horses that had found their way to his ranch. They were a family, looking out for each other, even in their darkest hour. Lucy's voice pierced through the storm. "Dad! There's more of them!" She had ventured to the edge of the porch, wrapped in her winter coat, her eyes wide with both excitement and fear. "The old barn! We can use the old barn!" Tom had almost forgotten about the old structure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They'd stopped using it years ago after building the new one, but its core was still solid. It wasn't ideal, but it might be their only option. He turned back toward the house to tell Lucy to stay put, but she was already racing through the snow. Toward him, determination written across her young face. "Lucy, get back inside!" Tom shouted, but his voice was lost in the wind. The horses shifted nervously at the sudden movement, the stallion positioning himself between the herd and the approaching girl. Tom's heart raced. One wrong move, one spooked horse, and his daughter could be seriously hurt. But Lucy moved with a confidence that belied her years. She stopped several feet away from the horses, then did something that made Tom's breath catch. She began to sing. Her clear voice carried through the storm, an old lullaby that her mother used to sing to her, the same one she now used to calm nervous horses during thunderstorms. The effect was immediate and extraordinary. The horses' ears pricked forward, their tense muscles relaxing slightly. Even the stallion's defensive posture softened, his eyes fixed on Lucy with something approaching wonder. Tom had never seen anything like it. His daughter, standing in the heart of a blizzard, singing to a group of wild horses as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Emma appeared at Tom's side, her face a mixture of fear and pride as she watched their daughter. "The old barn's our only choice," she whispered. "James is already there, opening the doors and spreading the emergency hay we stored last summer." Tom nodded, his mind racing through their options. The old barn wasn't ideal. Its roof had a small leak, and the insulation wasn't great, but it was shelter. And right now, that's all that mattered. He turned to Emma, his voice urgent but steady. "Get Lucy back inside. I'll try to lead them to the barn." But Emma shook her head, snow gathering in her dark hair. "We do this together, all of us." There was a steel in her voice that Tom recognized, the same determination she'd shown when they'd first bought this struggling ranch, when everyone said they were crazy to try and make it work. A sharp crack echoed through the valley, followed by a low, ominous rumble. Tom's blood ran cold. He knew that sound. Somewhere up on Evergreen Ridge, the weight of the snow was shifting. If it triggered an avalanche, they'd have bigger problems than finding shelter for wild horses. The stallion sensed it too, his head rising sharply as he stared toward the ridge. The other horses grew restless, their survival instincts screaming at them to run. But run where? In this storm, blind panic would be just as deadly as the cold. Lucy's voice never wavered, her song providing an anchor in the chaos. The white-blazed mare moved closer to her, drawn perhaps by the youth in her. Voice or some deeper connection that Tom couldn't understand. The mare's movement seemed to decide something for the stallion. He took a tentative step toward Lucy, then another, the rest of the herd following his lead. "The sugar cubes," Emma whispered urgently. "Use them now, while they're calm." Tom pulled the sugar from his pocket with trembling fingers. The stallion's nostrils flared at the sweet scent, and Tom saw the battle playing out in those wild eyes. Trust versus survival, hope versus fear. Slowly, with infinite care, the proud animal stretched its neck forward and took the sugar from Tom's palm. It was a small moment, a tiny victory against the storm's fury, but it changed everything. The connection was made, fragile as a thread of spider's silk, but real. Tom didn't dare breathe as he took a step backward, then another, sugar cubes held. Out like a lifeline. The procession through the storm would stay forever etched in Tom's memory, Lucy singing her gentle song. The stallion following Tom's offered sugar, the mare staying close to Lucy, and the rest of the herd moving as one through the swirling snow. Emma walked beside them, her presence steady and calming, while James waited at the old barn, its doors opened like welcoming arms. The interior of the old barn was musty but dry, its sturdy walls cutting off the wind's howl to a distant moan. James had done an impressive job, spreading hay in thick piles for bedding and dragging over the emergency water trough. The space was bigger than Tom remembered, with enough room for all 4 horses if they didn't mind close quarters. As the horses filed in, Tom could finally see them clearly in the light of the barn's old fixtures. Besides the stallion and the white-blazed mare, there was an older gelding with a greying muzzle and a young colt who couldn't have been more than a year old. All of them were in rough shape, their wild beauty masked by ice and exhaustion. Lucy moved to close the barn doors, but a sound made her pause. Through the curtain of snow, more shapes were emerging. Tom's heart sank. More horses. But these shapes were different, moving with purpose rather than desperation. Headlights cut through the storm, and the distinctive sound of chains on tires crunched through the snow. Dr. Rachel Stewart's old truck appeared like a miracle, followed by another vehicle Tom recognized. As belonging to Mark Thompson, their closest neighbor, help had arrived, but as another rumble echoed from Evergreen Ridge, Tom knew their night was far from over. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Rachel worked tirelessly, checking each horse for injuries while Mark helped Tom, and Emma set up emergency heating in the old barn. Lucy and James made countless trips through the snow, carrying blankets, water, and supplies. The horses watched it all with wary exhaustion, too tired to resist as Rachel treated their wounds and checked them for frostbite. "They're lucky," Rachel said finally, straightening up from examining the colt. "Another hour out there." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what she meant. The storm had nearly claimed these proud creatures, but something, fate, instinct, or maybe something more, had led them to Pine Creek Ranch. Mark Thompson stood in the barn doorway, watching the ridge with worried eyes. "That snow's still shifting up there if it breaks loose." He trailed off, but the concern in his voice was clear. An avalanche wouldn't reach the ranch buildings, but it could cut off the road completely, trapping them all here. The stallion suddenly lifted his head, letting out a low, urgent whinny. The other horses immediately tensed, and Tom felt it too, a change in the air, a shift in the storm's voice. Something was coming, something that would test them all, in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Rachel moved to the barn door, her experienced eyes scanning the darkness. "There's another storm cell moving in. This is just the beginning." She turned to Tom, her face grave. "Whatever we decide to do with these horses, we need to decide fast. We might all be stuck here for days." The gravity of their situation settled over the barn like a heavy blanket. They had saved the horses from freezing to death, but at what cost? The ranch's resources were limited, and with another storm approaching, they needed to think about their own survival too. Lucy spoke. up from where she sat beside the white-blazed mare, her small hand resting on the horse's neck. "We can't send them back out there. They came to us for help. They trusted us." Emma moved to stand beside her daughter, her expression thoughtful. "Lucy's right. These horses found us for a reason. Sometimes the right thing to do isn't the easy thing." Tom looked at the stallion, remembering that moment of connection when the proud animal had taken sugar from his hand. The horse met his gaze steadily, and in those wild eyes Tom saw something that moved him deeply. Not just the will to survive, but the courage to trust. The wind outside rose to a fevered pitch, and the old barn creaked ominously. Mark and Rachel exchanged worried glances, both knowing they needed to leave soon if they were going to make it home safely. But as another rumble echoed from the ridge, everyone in the barn knew their fates were now intertwined. The Mitchell family, their unexpected guests, and whatever the storm had in store for them. Tom squared his shoulders, making a decision that would change not just this night, but all their lives. "Rachel, what do you need to keep these horses alive and healthy? Mark, can you check our backup generator? Emma, start making a list of supplies. Lucy, James, these horses are going to need names. They're not just visitors anymore." As his family sprang into action, Tom caught the stallion watching him again. In that moment, he could have sworn he saw gratitude in those wild eyes, an understanding that transcended the barriers between man and beast. The storm raged on outside, but within the old barn of Pine Creek Ranch, something extraordinary was taking root. A bond forged in desperation that would grow into something none of them could have imagined. The night was still young, and nature had more challenges in store for them all. But as Tom Mitchell watched his family working together to help these wild creatures, he knew that sometimes the biggest changes in life come not from careful planning, but from the courage to open your heart when destiny knocks on your door, or in this case, when it brings 4 frozen horses to your ranch in the storm of the century. High above Pine Creek Ranch, the snow on Evergreen Ridge shifted again, and the wind carried with it the promise of more trials to come. But for now, in the warmth of the old barn, 8 hearts beat as one, each finding strength in the presence of the others. The real test of their newfound bond was about to begin, and none of them could have predicted the amazing journey that lay ahead. The next moment would prove crucial as the old barn's lights flickered ominously, and a new sound joined the storm's fury, one that would force them all to dig deeper than they ever had before. The ancient wiring of the old barn gave one final protesting spark before plunging everything into darkness. In the sudden blackness, the horses' nervous shuffling echoed against the wooden walls, their breath coming in quick, frightened bursts. Tom felt his way along the rough-hewn boards, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Everyone stay calm. The emergency lights should kick in." But the backup system remained silent, its batteries likely frozen in the unprecedented cold. Through the gaps in the barn's weathered planks, the storm's fury intensified, transforming the peaceful Montana night into a battleground of ice and wind. Rachel Stewart's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the concerned faces of those gathered in the barn. "The generator," Emma said, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Mark, did you get a chance to check it?" Mark Thompson's silhouette moved toward the barn door, his experience as a rancher evident in his deliberate movements. "I'll head out now. Tom, you got any diesel fuel stored nearby?" Before Tom could answer, a sound like thunder rolled down from Evergreen Ridge, but this was no ordinary weather event. The deep, sustained rumble grew louder, and even the sturdy old barn seemed to tremble. The horses sensed it first. The stallion's head shot up, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring with primal fear. "Avalanche!" Rachel's warning cut through the darkness. "Everyone away from the north wall." They scrambled to move, guiding the horses toward the southern end of the barn. Lucy's voice rose above the chaos, singing her lullaby again, trying to keep the animals calm as the sound of rushing snow grew louder. The white-blazed mare pressed close to her, seeking comfort in the young girl's presence. The rumble reached its crescendo, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Then came the impact, not a direct hit, but the edge of the avalanche's force slammed into the north side of the barn. The old timbers groaned in protest, decades of weathered wood fighting against nature's fury. A section of the roof creaked ominously, and snow began filtering through newly formed cracks. James clung to his mother's side, his young voice trembling but determined. "The horses! We need to protect the horses!" Tom's mind raced. The barn was still standing, but for how long? They needed light, heat, and a way to secure the structure before it gave in to the weight of the snow now piling against its walls. But more than that, they needed a miracle. As if in answer to that unspoken prayer, headlights pierced the gloom outside. Through the storm came the distinctive rumble of a heavy-duty truck, followed by the sharp beep of a reversing vehicle. The barn door burst open, revealing Ben Cooper, the local sheriff, and behind him, Sarah Anderson from the feed store. "Thought you folks might need some help," Ben called out, his powerful flashlight beam sweeping the barn's interior. "Got a generator in the truck and Sarah's brought emergency supplies. The whole town's mobilizing. Word got out about the wild horses." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Under Ben's direction, they formed a human chain, passing supplies into the barn while Mark and Tom worked to set up the generator. Sarah, who'd grown up on a ranch herself, helped Rachel tend to the horses, her gentle touch and quiet confidence helping to keep them calm. Lucy and James became the heart of the operation, their young energy seemingly endless as they carried blankets, water, and feed. The white-blazed mare had taken to following Lucy whenever she moved, while the old gelding seemed to have developed a soft spot for James, nickering softly whenever the boy passed by. Emma organized it all with the efficiency of a battlefield commander, making sure everyone had what they needed while keeping track of their dwindling supplies. The generator hummed to life under Mark's experienced hands, and light flooded the barn once more, revealing the full scope of their situation. The avalanche had shifted the barn's northern wall, creating a slight lean that, while not immediately dangerous, would need to be addressed. Snow had drifted in through new gaps in the roof, creating small white piles on the dirt floor. But the horses were safe. The people were unharmed, and somehow the old barn was still standing. "We need to reinforce that wall," Ben said, his law enforcement training giving way to his ranch country upbringing. "Got some timber in my truck that might work as bracing." Sarah stepped forward, her practical nature showing through. "The feed store's got plenty of supplies, and Miller's Crossing is rallying. People are gathering everything they can spare. The blankets, feed, tools. They'll try to get through once the avalanche debris is cleared." Tom felt a surge of emotion at this show of community support. In their little corner of Montana, neighbors still looked out for each other, still came together when times got tough. But as another gust of wind rattled the barn's frame, he knew they weren't out of danger yet. The stallion suddenly moved from his position near the other horses, approaching Tom with measured steps. In the generator's steady light, Tom could see the ice finally melting from the horse's coat, revealing a deep bay color underneath. The proud animal stopped in front of him, and for a moment they regarded each other, man and horse, each carrying the weight of responsibility for their respective families. Rachel watched the interaction with professional interest. "He's choosing you," she said softly. "Wild horses don't usually bond this quickly, but there's something special about this one. He knows you saved his herd." Lucy appeared at Tom's aside, her hand automatically reaching up to stroke the stallion's neck. "He needs a name, Dad. They all do." Emma joined them, her eyes soft as she watched the stallion lean slightly into Lucy's touch. What about Storm, since he brought his family through one to find us? The stallion's ears pricked forward at the sound of the name, and Tom couldn't help but smile. Storm it is! He turned to the white-blazed mare that had bonded with Lucy. And what about her? Hope, Lucy said without hesitation, because that's what she gave us by trusting us. The old gelding with the greying muzzle became Sage, James's choice, for the wisdom in his gentle eyes. The young colt, whose spirit remained bright despite his ordeal, they named Star, for the small white marking on his forehead that became visible as the ice melted away. As they worked to secure the barn and make the horses comfortable, Tom noticed something remarkable. The animals, though still wild, had begun to respond to their names, turning their heads when called, accepting care with increasing trust. It was as if they understood that their lives had changed forever the moment they emerged from the storm. Ben returned from checking the avalanche damage, his expression grave. Roads completely blocked. Thompson Trail is buried under 20 feet of snow, and the alternative routes are impossible in this weather. We're all stuck here until the storm passes and crews can clear a path. Sarah looked up from where she was helping Emma inventory. Supplies. We've got enough feed for a few days, maybe a week if we stretch it. The real question is whether this old barn will hold. As if to emphasize her point, the wind outside rose to a fevered pitch, and the damaged wall creaked ominously. Storm, the stallion, moved protectively closer to his herd, but there was no panic in his movement now. Instead, he watched the humans with what almost seemed like curiosity as they worked to protect his family. We need to stabilize that wall before the next storm cell hits, Mark said, his years of ranching experience evident in his voice. But we'll need more hands, more materials than what we've got. Rachel finished checking Star, the young colt, for signs of frostbite. The horses are doing better, but they're still at risk. Moving them isn't an option. They're too weak, and there's nowhere to move them to anyway. Tom looked around. The barn at the unlikely group gathered there, his family, his neighbors, 4 wild horses, all brought together by chance and nature's fury. The challenge ahead seemed impossible, but then again, so had the idea of saving 4 frozen horses. In the storm of the century, Lucy's voice rose again in song, the same lullaby that had first calmed the horses. This time, though, others joined in. Emma, then Sarah, their voices blending in the lantern-lit barn. The horses' ears pricked forward, and even the worried faces of the adults softened as the simple melody filled the space. The moment was broken by a sharp crack from above, another section of the roof giving way under the snow's weight. Ben's flashlight beam caught the cascade of snow and ice that followed, but Storm was already moving, pushing Hope and Star away from the danger zone with surprising gentleness. "We need to act now," Tom said, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Ben, Mark, help me with those support beams. Rachel, Sarah, see what you can do about patching those roof holes. Emma, keep track of where we need reinforcement. Kids, stay with the horses, keep them calm." As they sprang into action, Tom caught Storm watching him again. In the stallion's eyes, he saw something that gave him hope, a reflection of his own determination, his own will to protect what mattered most. They were no longer just people trying to save wild horses. They were 2 families fighting for survival together. The night was far from over, and the storm still raged beyond the barn's walls. But as Tom Mitchell watched his community come together, watched his children bond with these wild creatures, watched Storm stand guard over both his equine and human family, he knew they would find a way through this. Above them, the wind howled with renewed fury, and somewhere in the darkness, another avalanche was building. But in the old barn at Pine Creek Ranch, a miracle was unfolding, one that would become legend in Miller's Crossing, a story of how 4 frozen horses brought out the best in a community and changed lives forever. The real test was still to come. as the barn's damaged wall groaned under another assault from the wind, and the generator's steady hum faltered for just a moment. Tom squared his shoulders, ready to face whatever challenges the night might bring, knowing he wasn't facing them alone anymore. Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts, urgent but controlled. "Tom, we've got another problem. You need to see this." She stood at the barn's south door, holding it open just enough to reveal a sight that made Tom's heart skip a beat. Through the swirling snow, more shapes were emerging from the storm, and this time they weren't horses. Through the curtain of snow emerged 3 elk, their massive forms moving with desperate purpose through the deepening drifts. Behind them, barely visible in the storm's fury, came 2 more shapes, wolves, their lean bodies betraying their hunger as they stalked their prey. The storm had driven predator and prey alike down from the high country, turning Pine Creek Ranch into an unlikely sanctuary. Sarah quickly shut the barn door, but not before Storm caught the scent of the approaching animals. The stallion's nostrils flared, and a low rumble rose from his chest. The other horses shifted nervously, picking up on their leader's tension. Lucy moved instinctively to Hope's side, while James pressed closer to Sage, the old gelding positioning himself protectively in front of the boy. "This complicates things," Ben said, his sheriff's training evident in his measured tone. "Those elk are going to need shelter too, and those wolves aren't going to give up easily in this weather." Tom's mind raced through their options. The old barn was already stretched to its limits with 4 horses. Adding 3 full-grown elk would be nearly impossible, especially with the structural damage they were fighting. But leaving them to the wolves in this storm seemed equally unthinkable. Emma stepped forward, her practical nature taking over. "The equipment shed. It's not as warm as the barn, but it's solid. We could clear enough space." Rachel nodded slowly, understanding Emma's plan. "The wolves won't approach with this many people around. If we can get the elk to the shed, they might have a chance." Mark was already moving toward the door, his weathered face set with determination. "We'll need to form a line, guide them in. Sarah, you still got those emergency flares in your truck?" "Better than that," Sarah replied, pulling off her heavy coat and reaching into an inside pocket. "I've got my father's old cattle horn. Used to use it to call the herd home in weather like this." Tom turned to his children, knowing they wouldn't like what he had to say. "Lucy, James, you stay here with the horses. They trust you, and we need them calm while we deal with this." To his surprise, neither child protested. Lucy was already singing softly to Hope, while James had his hand resting on Star's neck, the young colt pressing close to the boy as if seeking reassurance. They understood their role in this unfolding drama, and Tom felt a surge of pride at their maturity. The adults moved quickly, gathering what they needed for their rescue attempt. Ben retrieved powerful flashlights from his patrol vehicle, while Mark and Tom collected ropes and blankets. Sarah stood ready with her father's horn, its brass surface gleaming dully in the generator's light. Emma touched Tom's arm before he could head out. "Be careful," she whispered. "Those wolves are desperate too." The moment they stepped outside, the storm's fury hit them full force. The wind had somehow grown even stronger, driving snow and ice horizontally through the air. The elk were closer now, their massive forms dark shadows against the white landscape. The wolves followed at a distance, their eyes gleaming with hunger and determination. Sarah raised the horn to her lips and blew. The deep, resonant sound cut through the storm's howl, startling both predator and prey. The elk hesitated, their heads turning toward the barn. The wolves paused too, uncertain about this new development. Tom and Ben moved to one side, while Mark and Rachel took the other, creating a human corridor between the elk and the equipment shed. Sarah continued to sound the horn, its call seeming to reach into some primitive part of the animal's brains, offering direction in the chaos. The largest elk, a bull with magnificent antlers, made the decision first. Perhaps recognizing their intentions, or simply too exhausted to resist, he began moving toward the shed. The other two elk followed, their instinct to stay together overriding their fear of humans. The wolves watched this development with hungry frustration. One of them, bolder than its companion, started to move forward, but Ben's powerful flashlight beam caught it full in the face, causing it to retreat. These weren't evil creatures. They were simply trying to survive, like everything else in this storm. Inside the barn, Storm suddenly let out a powerful neigh that carried even through the thick walls. The elk responded with their own calls, creating an eerie symphony that rose above the storm's voice. It was as if the animals were communicating something beyond human understanding, a shared acknowledgement of their common struggle against nature's fury. Guiding 3 frightened elk through a blizzard to an equipment shed was no easy task, but somehow they managed it. Sarah's horn provided direction, while the humans formed a protective barrier against the watching wolves. The shed, when they reached it, was cluttered but sound. Mark and Tom worked quickly to clear space, while Ben and Rachel kept their lights trained on the predators. The elk moved inside with surprising docility, their sides heaving with exhaustion. Up close, Tom could see they were in rough shape, their coats crusted with ice, much like the horses had been. These magnificent creatures had been through their own ordeal before finding their way to Pine Creek Ranch. The wolves paced at the edge of the light, their frustration evident in every movement. Sarah lowered the horn, her breath coming in white puffs in the frozen air. "They need help too," she said softly. "They're just as trapped by this storm as everything else." Emma appeared from the barn, carrying something in her arms. Even from a distance, Tom could smell what it was, the meat they'd been saving for the week's meals. "Leave it for them," she called out. "Far enough from the buildings, but where they can find it." It was practical thinking. Fed wolves were less likely to threaten their livestock, but it was also an act of compassion, recognizing that every creature deserved a chance to survive this night. Mark helped Emma place the meat at a safe distance, and they all watched as the wolves gradually approached it, their caution warring. With their hunger, back in the barn, they found Lucy and James exactly where they'd left them, still comforting the horses. But something had changed in their absence. Storm was standing near the damaged wall, his head pressed against one of the weakened boards. As they watched, he shifted his weight and pushed, causing the board to move slightly. Rachel noticed it. "First, he's trying to help," she said wonderingly. "He can sense the wall's weakness, and he's trying to brace it." The other horses had positioned themselves similarly, using their bodies to support the struggling structure. It was as if they understood that their survival depended on the barn's stability, and were doing what they could to help maintain it. "Smart animals," Ben remarked, but there was awe in his voice. These weren't just wild creatures anymore, they were partners in survival. A sharp crack from above interrupted the moment. Another section of the roof was giving way under the snow's weight. Without hesitation, Storm moved to shield Hope and Star, while Sage did the same for Lucy and James. The humans scrambled to clear the falling snow and ice, working together with an efficiency born of desperation. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. "The generator's struggling. We're losing power." The lights flickered ominously, casting dancing shadows on the barn walls. The temperature, which had been barely manageable, began to drop. They could lose everything: heat, light, and most importantly, the ability to keep these animals alive through the night. Tom looked around at the faces in the barn. His family, his neighbors, these extraordinary horses that had chosen to trust them. The night had already asked so much of them all, but it wasn't done yet. They needed a solution, and they needed it fast. Lucy spoke up, her young voice steady despite the tension. "The horses are warming each other. We could do the same thing. Pray, share body heat, conserve energy." Emma picked up on her daughter's idea. She's right. We can create a warm core in the center of the barn, people and horses together. It was unprecedented. Wild horses, domestic horses, and humans, all sharing the same small space. But as another blast of wind rattled the barn's frame, they realized they had no choice. This was about survival, about finding ways to endure together. They began rearranging the barn's interior, creating a central area where they could all stay warm. The horses, surprisingly, seemed to understand what was needed. Storm positioned himself where he could both support the weakened wall and help block the draft. Hope and Star huddled close to Lucy and James, while Sage stood guard near Emma and Sarah. Ben and Mark worked on the generator, trying to coax more life from it while conserving what fuel remained. Rachel and Tom distributed the remaining blankets, creating nest-like areas where they could rest while staying close enough to share warmth. Outside, the storm raged on, and the wolves could be heard calling to each other in the darkness. The elk in the equipment shed added their own voices. To the night's wild chorus, it was as if the very elements were testing them, pushing them to their limits to see what they were made of. Sarah pulled out her father's horn once more, but this time she didn't blow it. Instead, she began telling stories about her father, about growing up on a ranch where every winter brought its own challenges. Others joined in, sharing tales of survival, of communities coming together, of humans and animals helping each other through impossible situations. Lucy's lullaby wove through their stories, creating a gentle backdrop that seemed to soothe both people and animals. The horse's ears would prick forward when she sang, and even the wind's howl seemed less threatening when accompanied by her clear young voice. As the night deepened, something extraordinary began to happen in that old barn. The boundaries between wild and tame, between human and animal, began to blur. They were no longer separate groups thrown together by circumstance. They were one family fighting together for survival. Tom watched as his daughter fell asleep, leaning against Hope's warm side, the mare standing perfectly still to avoid disturbing her. James was curled up near Sage, the old gelding positioning himself to block any draft that might reach the boy. Storm remained vigilant, but his eyes would often meet Tom's, sharing the watch over their combined family. The generator hummed softly. In the background, its sound now comforting rather than concerning. They had managed to stabilize it, though no one knew how long it would last. The barn's damaged wall creaked occasionally, but the horses' bodies helped brace it, their strength becoming part of the building's strength. Emma moved to stand beside Tom, her hand finding his in the dim light. "We're going to make it," she said softly, and it wasn't just hope in her voice, it was certainty. Looking around the barn at this unlikely gathering, at the trust and cooperation that had developed in just one night, Tom believed her. They would make it, not because of any one person's strength, but because they had learned to combine their strengths, to trust each other, to work together in ways that defied explanation. The storm still raged outside, and dawn was still ours. Away, but in that old barn at Pine Creek Ranch, something magical was happening, a transformation that would leave none of them unchanged. As another gust of wind rattled the walls, Storm turned his head to look at Tom, and in those wild eyes, there was no fear anymore. There was only determination, trust, and something that looked remarkably like hope. But the night wasn't done testing them yet. A new sound joined the Storm's symphony, something that made Storm's ears prick forward and caused Ben to reach for his flashlight. It was a sound that would force them to dig even deeper, to find reserves of strength they didn't know they had. And as Lucy stirred in her sleep, Hope nickering softly to reassure her, they all knew that their greatest challenge was still to come. The sound that sliced through the winter night was unmistakable, the distressed cry of a mare in labor. It echoed from the equipment shed where the elk had taken refuge, a sound both primal and urgent. Rachel Stewart was on her feet instantly, her veterinarian instincts kicking in despite her exhaustion. "One of the elk," she said, already reaching for her medical bag. "She's probably been holding off as long as she could. The stress of the storm must have triggered it." Tom exchanged glances with Ben and Mark. Helping a wild elk give birth in the middle of a blizzard wasn't something any of them had trained for. Storm's ears were pricked forward, his entire body tense as he listened to the elk's cries. Something in his posture reminded Tom of himself whenever his own family needed him. "We have to help her," Lucy said, now fully awake and pressed against Hope's warm side. The white-blazed mare nickered softly, as if agreeing with the young girl's assessment. Emma was already organizing supplies, her teacher's ability to maintain calm in chaos proving invaluable. "Sarah, we'll need more light. Mark, Ben, get ready to help Rachel. Tom." She paused, looking at her husband with concern. "Someone needs to stay here with the horses." The elk's cries grew more urgent, and the wolves' howls responded. From somewhere in the darkness, they were still out there waiting, and now they had even more reason to stay close. A newborn elk calf would be easy prey if they could get to it. "I'll stay," James volunteered, his young voice steady despite the tension. "Sage and I can watch things here." The old gelding moved closer to the boy, as if accepting this shared responsibility. Tom nodded, proud of his son's courage. "Lucy, you stay too. The horses trust you, and we can't risk them panicking if something goes wrong." The group split up, with Rachel leading the way to the equipment shed. The moment they stepped outside, the storm's fury reminded them of its presence. The wind cut through their layers like knives, and the snow was so thick they could barely see 3 feet ahead. Sarah's father's horn sounded once more, not to guide this time, but to ward off the wolves they knew were watching. Its deep tone carried through the storm, a reminder to the predators that humans were still present and vigilant. Inside the equipment shed, the scene was both magnificent and terrifying. The pregnant elk cow lay on her side, her sides heaving with contractions. The bull elk stood protectively nearby, his massive antlers catching the light from their flashlights. The third elk, a younger female, paced nervously at the edge of their makeshift shelter. Rachel approached slowly, her movements deliberate and calm. "She's having trouble," she said softly, her experienced eyes taking in the situation. "The calf's positioned wrong. We need to help her now, or we'll lose them both." Tom had assisted with difficult births before. It was part of ranch life, but never with a wild elk. The cow's eyes rolled with fear as they approached, and the bull elk pawed the ground warningly. "Talk to them," Emma suggested, remembering how Lucy's voice had calmed the horses. "Let them know we're here to help." Sarah stepped forward, her father's horn held carefully in one hand. Instead of blowing it, she began to sing, not Lucy's lullaby, but an old ranch song her father had taught her, one about finding shelter in storms. Her voice, though rougher than Lucy's, carried the same genuine care and compassion. The effect wasn't immediate, but gradually the elk began to settle. The cow's fearful movements calmed somewhat, though her labor pains continued. The bull elk stopped pawing the ground, his great head turning to watch them with what seemed like consideration rather than threat. Rachel moved in slowly, her hands steady as she examined the laboring elk. "The calf's turned wrong," she confirmed. "We need to rotate it, give it a chance to be born normally. But she has to let us help her." Tom positioned himself near the elk's head, speaking softly as he'd done with countless horses and cattle over the years. The cow's eye rolled to look at him, and in that wild gaze he saw the same trust he'd witnessed in Storm's eyes. The recognition that sometimes survival meant accepting help from unexpected sources. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Rachel worked tirelessly to reposition the calf, while Emma and Sarah kept the elk calm with their voices. Mark and Ben stood guard at the shed's entrance, watching for wolves while keeping track of the storm's progression. Tom stayed by the elk's head, maintaining that fragile connection of trust that made their intervention possible. Outside, they could hear Lucy's voice carrying from the barn, her lullaby joining Sarah's ranch songs in an impromptu duet that seemed to weave a spell of calm over the entire ranch. The wolves' howls had gone quiet, and even the storm seemed to have lessened its assault, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Finally, Rachel sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the cold. The calves turned. Now it's up to her. The elk cow seemed to understand that her part in this dance was beginning. With a mighty effort, she began to push. The bull elk moved closer, his presence both protective and encouraging. The younger elk stopped her nervous pacing, all of them connected in this moment of creation, despite the storm raging outside. The calf came into the world in a rush of movement and new life, its wet coat gleaming in the flashlight beams. Rachel moved quickly to clear its airways, while the mother elk began the ancient process of cleaning her newborn. The calf, a female, was small but perfect, her legs already trembling with the effort to stand. A sound from outside made them all freeze, pawing at the shed's door, followed by an insistent nickering. Ben's flashlight beam caught Storm's proud profile through a gap in the boards. Somehow the stallion had left the barn and followed them, drawn perhaps by some instinct. They couldn't understand. Sarah opened the door just enough for Storm to look in. The stallion's gaze swept the scene, taking in the new mother and her calf, the protective bull elk, the humans who had helped bring this new life into the world. For a moment, predator and prey, wild and domestic, all existed in perfect harmony, united by the miracle they had just witnessed. The calf managed to stand on wobbling legs, and her first uncertain steps carried her toward the shed door where Storm watched. The bull elk tensed, but the mother seemed unworried. The baby elk and the wild stallion regarded each other with innocent curiosity, two different species sharing a moment of recognition. Lucy's voice floated to them through the storm, her lullaby seeming particularly appropriate now. Storm turned his head toward the barn, nickering softly, then looked back at Tom. The message was clear. It was time to return to their own family. As they prepared to leave the shed, Rachel checked the mother elk one last time. "They'll be fine," she assured them. "She's strong, and the calf is healthy. They just need rest and shelter until the storm passes." The walk back to the barn was easier somehow, as if the birth of the elk calf had renewed their energy and purpose. Storm walked beside them, his presence a reminder of how much had changed in just one night. Wild horses, elk, wolves, and humans, all finding ways to survive together in the face of nature's fury. Inside the barn, they found Lucy and James exactly where they'd left them, surrounded by the other horses. Hope immediately went to Storm, touching noses with him as if asking about what he'd witnessed. Sage stood steady beside James, while Star pranced excitedly at the return of the humans he'd come to trust. The generator hummed steadily in the background, and the damaged wall seemed to have stabilized somewhat. The horses' body heat had helped raise the temperature inside the barn, creating a pocket of warmth that felt like a miracle after the bitter cold outside. Emma gathered her children close, sharing the story of the elk calf's birth in quiet tones. Lucy's eyes shone with wonder, while James listened intently, his hand absently stroking Sage's neck. These children who had grown up on a ranch were witnessing something extraordinary, a night when the usual boundaries between wild and tame simply ceased to exist. Sarah brought out her father's horn once more, but this time she didn't sing. Instead, she began telling stories about other nights like this one, when storms had brought unlikely groups together, when survival depended on trust and cooperation. The wolves' howls had started up again, but they seemed more distant now, as if they too were settling in to wait out the storm. Ben checked his watch, surprised to find that midnight had come and gone. They were now in the deepest part of the night, the hours when storms often gathered their worst fury. As if reading his thoughts, the wind outside rose to a new pitch, and the barn's timbers creaked ominously. Storm moved to his position near the damaged wall, his body once again helping to brace the weakened structure. The other horses followed, his lead arranging themselves to provide maximum support where it was needed most. Tom watched them with growing amazement. These weren't just animals seeking shelter anymore. They were partners in survival, actively working to protect the sanctuary they'd found. Rachel sat down heavily on a hay bale, the adrenaline of the elk birth finally wearing off. In all my years as a vet, I've never seen anything like this. Night, she said softly. It's like everything we thought we knew about wild animals has been turned upside down. Mark nodded, his weathered face thoughtful. Maybe we're the ones who've been turned upside down. Maybe we needed a night like this to remind us of what's possible when we stop seeing differences and start seeing connections. A particularly strong gust of wind rattled the barn, causing everyone to tense. But the horses remained calm, their steady presence somehow reassuring. Lucy's voice rose in her lullaby once more, and this time others joined in. Emma, Sarah, even Ben and Mark, adding their deeper voices to the melody. The song seemed to fill the barn with something more than just music. It carried their shared experience, their combined strength, their growing understanding that they were all part of something larger than themselves. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside this old barn, a new kind of family had formed. Tom looked around at this unlikely gathering. His wife and children, his neighbors and friends, 4 wild horses that had chosen to trust them, and beyond the barn walls, a family of elk with their newborn calf. The night had brought them all together, but something told him their connection wouldn't end when the storm passed. Storm caught his eye, and in that steady gaze, Tom saw his own thoughts reflected. They had all been changed by this night, touched by something that went beyond mere survival. As another blast of wind shook the barn, Tom realized that their greatest challenge wasn't just staying alive through the storm. It was figuring out how to hold on to this miracle once the weather cleared. Their main source of warmth, a sharp crack from the repaired beam, made everyone freeze. Storm reacted instantly, resuming his position beneath it, but Tom could see the stallion was exhausted. They all were. The night had thrown challenge after challenge at them, and their resources were running thin. "The elk," Lucy said suddenly, her face pale in the dim light. "We need to check on them and the baby." She was right, but the equipment shed was several yards away through the storm, and without the generator's exterior lights, the distance might as well have been miles. The quake could have damaged the shed's structure, potentially trapping or injuring the animals inside. Sarah reached for her father's horn, but stopped short. A new sound had joined the storm's voice, the cry of more than just their 3 elk. Through the gaps in the barn walls, they could see dark shapes moving through the snow. The quake had driven more wildlife down from the high country, and they were all heading toward Pine Creek Ranch. "They can sense it's safe here," Rachel said softly, her veterinarian's understanding of animal behavior coming to the fore. "They know this is their best chance for survival." Tom looked around the barn at their already strained resources. They barely had enough space and supplies for their current guests. How could they possibly help more? But as he watched Storm, standing steady under the beam, still protecting them all despite his exhaustion, he knew they couldn't turn away animals in need. "James, Lucy, start sorting what's left of the hay. Emma, Rachel, we need to assess what medical supplies we still have. Mark, see what you can do with that generator. Ben, Sarah, we need to check the equipment shed and help guide these new arrivals to shelter." The barn had become more than just a haven from the storm. It was turning into an ark of sorts, a gathering place for all manner of creatures seeking refuge from nature's fury. The boundaries between wild and tame, prey and predator, human and animal, were dissolving in the face of shared survival needs. A particularly strong aftershock rattled the barn's frame, causing everyone to brace themselves. But this time, something was different. The horses didn't panic. Instead, they moved with purpose, positioning themselves to brace the weakened areas of the structure. They had learned from the earlier crisis, adapting their responses to protect their sanctuary. Lucy began to sing again, her clear voice carrying strength and comfort. The other horses joined Storm in supporting the barn's structure, while Sage helped guide the humans to the safest areas during each aftershock. They had become a team, each member instinctively knowing their role. Outside, Sarah's horn sounded, guiding the new arrivals through the storm. The elk in the equipment shed called back, their voices joining in a wild chorus that seemed to transcend species barriers. Even the wolves' distant howls had changed tone, becoming less threatening and more like part of the larger symphony of survival. The night was far from over, and they had no way of knowing what other challenges awaited them. But as Tom watched his family and neighbors working alongside these remarkable animals, he understood that something extraordinary was happening at Pine Creek Ranch. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about discovering connections that went deeper than anyone had imagined possible. Storm caught his eye, and in that proud stallion's gaze, Tom saw his own determination reflected. They would find a way through this, not because of any one individual's strength, but because they had learned to combine their strengths, to trust each other, to work together in ways that defied explanation. A new aftershock rumbled through the valley, and with it came a sound that made Storm's ears prick forward sharply. This new challenge would test their newfound unity in ways none of them could have anticipated, forcing them to dig even deeper into their reserves of courage and trust. The real test was just beginning, as nature seemed determined to throw everything it had at this unlikely family that had formed in the heart of the storm. But as Lucy's song filled the barn once more, and the horses stood steady against each tremor, they all knew that together they could face whatever came next. The night was about to reveal its greatest challenge yet, one that would require everything they had learned about trust, cooperation, and the unbreakable bonds that can form between all living creatures when faced with extraordinary circumstances. A deafening crack split the night air as lightning struck a massive pine near the barn, the electricity finding a path straight to the frozen ground. The concussion rattled the barn's timbers, and the generator's remains sparked ominously. The winter thunderstorm was a rare phenomenon, but its timing couldn't have been worse. Storm reared instinctively at the explosive sound, but even in his startled state, the stallion was careful to maintain his position, supporting the damaged beam. The other horses pressed closer together, their bodies trembling not just from cold, but from the primal fear of the lightning. "Fire!" Ben's sharp warning cut through the chaos. The lightning strike had ignited the pine tree's sap-filled core, and despite the storm, flames were beginning to climb the ancient trunk. If the fire spread to the barn's weather-worn wood, they would lose everything. Tom's mind raced through their options. The barn's old fire hose was frozen solid, and their winter water reserves were running dangerously low. The snow outside could help, but gathering enough of it quickly would be nearly impossible in these conditions. Lucy clutched Hope's mane, her young face illuminated by the growing flames. "The creek," she said suddenly. "Shadow Creek hasn't frozen completely. I saw it when we were looking for Star." Sarah nodded grimly. "The deep channel stays open all winter, but reaching it in this storm..." Emma stepped forward, her teacher's practical nature asserting itself. "We'll form teams. Some stay here with the horses, others handle the fire. We can't risk everyone out there." The decision was made quickly. Ben and Mark would lead the firefighting effort, while Rachel stayed to monitor the increasingly unstable barn. Tom looked at Storm, knowing he needed to help with the fire, but reluctant to leave the stallion holding up the beam alone. As if understanding their dilemma, Sage moved to take Storm's position. The old gelding's eyes held a wisdom that transcended his species as he carefully positioned himself under the failing timber. Storm hesitated for just a moment before allowing the switch, his trust in his newfound herd evident in every movement. The lightning had attracted more wildlife to their sanctuary. Through the barn's gaps, they could see deer, elk, and even a young moose moving through the snow, drawn by some instinct toward the relative safety of the ranch buildings. The wolves had returned too, but their behavior had changed. Instead of hunting, they seemed to be helping to guide the other animals, as if some ancient knowledge of survival had awakened in them. Lucy's voice rose in song once more as she worked with James to organize the blankets and remaining supplies. The melody seemed to calm not just the horses, but all the creatures gathering around the barn, creating a pocket of peace in the chaos of the storm. Sarah's horn sounded a different pattern now, not to ward off predators, but to guide the new arrivals to safety. The deep brass notes carried through the storm, joining with Lucy's song in an improvised duet that spoke of shelter and survival. Outside, the fight against the fire had begun in earnest. Ben and Mark worked with desperate efficiency, using snow and anything else they could find to contain the flames. The freezing wind was both help and hindrance, sometimes dampening the fire, but other times fanning it in dangerous new directions. Inside the barn, Rachel noticed something extraordinary. The horses had begun moving in a coordinated pattern, their bodies creating air currents that helped ventilate the smoke beginning to seep through the walls. It wasn't just instinct. They were actively working to protect their shelter and the other animals now crowding into the space. Hope stayed close to Lucy, helping the girl organize the new arrivals. The white-blazed mare seemed to have a calming effect on the wild creatures, her gentle presence helping to maintain order in what could have become dangerous chaos. Star, though still young, had taken on the role of messenger, moving between groups of animals with surprising authority. Emma worked alongside Rachel, her years of teaching experience translating surprisingly well to managing a barn full of frightened wildlife. She seemed to instinctively know which animals needed space and which ones could be safely grouped together. The thunder grew louder and more lightning illuminated the snow-filled sky. Each flash revealed new animals emerging from the storm, seeking refuge. The barn and equipment shed were already full, but they couldn't turn away creatures that would surely die in the brutal conditions outside. Sarah's voice carried above the storm as she directed the newest arrivals toward whatever shelter they could find. The wolves had taken up positions around the perimeter of the ranch buildings, no longer predators, but guardians of this extraordinary gathering. The fire in the pine tree was finally beginning to yield to their efforts, but the battle had taken its toll. The men stumbled back into the barn, exhausted and half frozen. The lightning had revealed another problem. The creek Lucy had mentioned was rising rapidly as the storm's runoff fed into it. What had been their potential salvation could now become a new threat, born of desperate necessity and trust in their four-legged companions. Storm would lead, his powerful body best suited to break through the current. Hope and Sage would follow, helping to create a stable path for the elk to follow. Star, still too young for such dangerous work, would stay in the barn with James and Emma. "Lucy, you can't go out there," Tom said firmly, but his daughter's response stopped him short. "Hope needs me, Dad. The elk will follow her better with me there. They trust us now." The truth of her words was undeniable. Throughout the night, Lucy's presence had helped bridge the gap between wild and domestic, her song creating a bond that transcended species. Emma stepped forward to protest, but the look in her daughter's eyes made her pause. Sarah raised her, father's horn to her lips, sounding a series of sharp, clear notes that cut through the storm. The signal was answered by howls from the wolves who had stationed themselves around the ranch. They would help guard the rescue path, their presence, keeping other predators at bay. The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity. Rachel and Ben secured ropes between the horses, creating a living chain that could withstand the flood's force. Mark and Tom worked to reinforce the barn's door, knowing the water would eventually reach them too. Storm stood steady as they prepared. His dark eyes focused on the task ahead. The stallion's exhaustion seemed to have fallen away, replaced by a fierce determination that inspired them all. Hope positioned herself behind him, with Lucy mounted on her back, while Sage took up the rear position. "Remember," Rachel called out as they prepared to move, "the elk calf won't be strong enough to fight the current. Someone will need to carry it." Sarah mounted her ranch horse, the horn secured at her side. She would help guide them back through the storm, its sound providing a beacon when visibility failed. The wolves moved closer, their presence both reassuring and surreal in this unprecedented situation. The moment they opened the barn door, the storm's full fury hit them. The wind drove snow and ice horizontally, while the roar of the approaching flood filled the air with its thunderous voice. Storm didn't hesitate. The stallion moved forward with purpose, his powerful legs pushing through the deepening water. Lucy's song rose above the chaos, providing comfort and guidance to all who could hear it. The elk in the shed responded, their calls becoming more focused, more hopeful. Hope moved perfectly in sync with the girl on her back, while Sage followed, with the steady reliability that had marked his actions all night. The water was knee-deep by the time they reached the equipment shed, its current tugging at the horse's legs. Storm positioned himself as a barrier, using his body to break the flow and create a calmer space near the shed's door. The elk bull emerged first, his massive antlers catching the dim light from Ben's distant flashlight. The mother elk followed, frantically calling her calf. The young one stumbled at the threshold, frightened by the water and confusion. Without hesitation, Lucy slipped from Hope's back into the freezing flood, moving to help guide the calf. The elk cow watched with what seemed like understanding as this human child helped her baby. Sarah's horn sounded, its tone changing to signal the water's rising speed. They needed to move now. Lucy managed to get the calf secured across Hope's strong back, the mother elk staying close to her offspring. The bull took up a protective position on the side, while Sage helped guide the younger female elk. The return journey to the barn was a battle against both water and wind. Storm led them with unwavering determination, choosing each step with care through the treacherous current. Lucy had remounted behind the elk calf, her song never faltering despite the cold and fear. From the barn, they could hear James calling encouragement, his young voice joining his sister's. The wolves paced alongside their strange procession, their presence keeping the other predators that had been drawn by the commotion at a respectful distance. Just as they were within sight of the barn, a massive surge of water hit them from the side. The flood had breached another section of a creek, bringing with it a wall of debris. Storm reacted instantly, turning to shield the others from the impact. A large branch struck his shoulder, but the stallion barely flinched, his focus entirely on protecting his expanded family. The elk calf cried out in fear, nearly slipping from Hope's back. Lucy managed to steady it, her small hands gentle but firm as she secured the young animal. The mother elk pressed close, adding her own body to the barrier against the current. Sarah's horn sounded with desperate urgency. The water was still rising, and the barn's position, though higher, wouldn't protect them forever. They needed to get everyone inside, and then find a way to protect their sanctuary from the flood. Through it all, the bonds that had formed in this extraordinary night only grew stronger. Wild and domestic animals moved as one, guided by the voices of those they had come to trust. The wolves, Traditional predators had become protectors. The elk, naturally wary of horses, now worked alongside them without hesitation. The final push to the barn seemed to take forever, though it was probably only minutes. Tom and Mark had created a ramp of hay bales and boards, providing a way up out of the floodwaters. Storm took the lead again, showing the others the safest path. Finally, they were all inside. The elk family huddled together, checking their calf for any injuries. Hope and Sage moved to rejoin Star, while Storm took up his position near the vulnerable wall, ever watchful despite his obvious pain from the branch's impact. Lucy slid to the ground, her clothes soaked and freezing. Emma rushed to wrap her daughter in blankets, but Lucy's attention was on the animals they'd just rescued. The elk calf looked at her with something like recognition, while its mother moved closer, gently nudging the girl with her nose. Rachel worked quickly to check everyone for injuries, paying special attention to Storm's shoulder. The stallion allowed her examination with remarkable patience, though his eyes never stopped monitoring the barn's entrance and the rising water outside. Sarah's horn sounded one final time before she secured the barn door. The tone was different now, not a warning or a guide, but almost a celebration. They had achieved something remarkable, not just saving lives, but breaking down barriers that had existed since the dawn of time. But their victory celebration was short-lived. A new sound emerged from the storm, something that made Storm's ears prick forward sharply. This next challenge would test their newfound bonds in ways they couldn't imagine, forcing them to dig even deeper into their reserves of strength and trust. The night was far from over, and nature seemed determined to throw everything it had at this remarkable gathering of souls. Yet as Lucy's song once again filled the barn, joined now by the gentle breathing of wild and domestic creatures alike, they faced the coming challenge not as separate species, but as one unified family, bound together by something stronger than fear or instinct. The real test was about to begin, as the floodwaters continued to rise and the storm gathered its strength for another assault. But in that moment, watching the extraordinary scene before him, Tom knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Humans, horses, elk, wolves, and all the other creatures that had found sanctuary in this old barn on this remarkable night. The mountain's groan echoed through the valley, a deep, primordial sound that made every creature in the barn freeze. The combination of earthquake, flood, and storm had destabilized the slope above Pine Creek Ranch, and now thousands of tons of earth were shifting, threatening to bury everything in its path. Storm was the first to react, his sharp whinny cutting through the stunned silence. The stallion's warning galvanized the other animals into action. The elk began moving toward the barn's far side, guided by some ancient instinct that told them where safety might lie. The wolves, still maintaining their protective vigil outside, started a chorus of urgent howls. "The back wall," Ben said, his sheriff's training helping him stay focused. "If that slope comes down, it's our only escape route, but it's not wide enough for everyone." Tom looked around at their extraordinary gathering, horses, elk, deer, and countless other creatures that had sought refuge in their barn. They couldn't save them all, not if the mountainside collapsed. The weight of this realization pressed down harder than the storm. Lucy moved closer to Hope, her small hand resting on the white-blazed mare's neck. "The horses know something," she said, watching as Storm and the others began to paw at the ground near the back wall. "Look at what they're doing." Sarah's eyes widened with understanding. "They're showing us where to dig, the ranch's old drainage tunnels. They run under this part of the property." Emma's teacher's mind quickly grasped the possibility. The original homesteaders would have built escape routes for their livestock. These horses, they can sense the hollow space beneath us. The mountain groaned again, and loose debris began to rattle down the slope. They had minutes, maybe less to the barn's structure, already weakened by earthquake and storm, wouldn't withstand a direct hit from the landslide. James, Lucy, gather every blanket and rope we have, Tom directed. Mark, Ben, help me with these floorboards. Sarah, keep sounding that horn. We need to guide any other animals out there to the escape route. Rachel worked quickly to check everyone for injuries, paying special attention to Storm's shoulder. The stallion allowed her examination with remarkable patience, though his eyes never stopped monitoring the barn's entrance and the rising water. Outside, Sarah's horn sounded one final time before she secured the barn door. The tone was different now, not a warning or a guide, but almost a celebration. They had achieved something remarkable, not just saving lives, but breaking down barriers that had existed since the dawn of time. But their victory celebration was short-lived. A new sound emerged from the storm, something that made Storm's ears prick forward sharply. This next challenge would test their newfound bonds in ways they couldn't imagine, forcing them to dig even deeper into their reserves of strength and trust. The night was far from over, and nature seemed determined to throw everything it had at this remarkable gathering of souls. Yet as Lucy's song once again filled the barn, joined now by the gentle breathing of wild and domestic creatures alike, they faced the coming challenge not as separate species, but as one unified family, bound together by something stronger than fear or instinct. The real test was about to begin, as the floodwaters continued to rise and the storm gathered its strength for another assault. But in that moment, watching the extraordinary scene before him, Tom knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Humans, horses, elk, wolves, and all the other creatures that had found sanctuary in this old barn on this remarkable night. The mountain's groan echoed through the valley, a deep, primordial sound that made every creature in the barn freeze. The combination of earthquake, flood, and storm had destabilized the slope above Pine Creek Ranch, and now thousands of tons of earth were shifting, threatening to bury everything in its path. Storm was the first to react, his sharp whinny cutting through the stunned silence. The stallion's warning galvanized the other animals into action. The elk began moving toward the barn's far side, guided by some ancient instinct that told them where safety might lie. The wolves, still maintaining their protective vigil outside, started a chorus of urgent howls. "The back wall," Ben said, his sheriff's training helping him stay focused. "If that slope comes down, it's our only escape route. But it's not wide, enough for everyone." Tom looked around at their extraordinary gathering, horses, elk, deer, and countless other creatures that had sought refuge in their barn. They couldn't save them all, not if the mountainside collapsed. The weight of this realization pressed down harder than the storm. Lucy moved closer to Hope, her small hand resting on the white-blazed mare's neck. "The horses know something," she said, watching as Storm and the others began to pour at the ground near the back wall. "Look at what they're doing." Sarah's eyes widened with understanding. "They're showing us where to dig. The ranch's old drainage tunnels. They run under this part of the property." Emma's teacher's mind quickly grasped the possibility. The original homesteaders would have built escape routes for their livestock. These horses, they can sense the hollow space beneath us. The mountain groaned again, and loose debris began to rattle down the slope. They had minutes, maybe less, to act. The barn's structure, already weakened by earthquake and storm, wouldn't withstand a direct hit from the landslide. "James, Lucy, gather every blanket and rope we have," Tom directed. "Mark, Ben, help me with these floorboards. Sarah, keep sounding that horn. We need to guide any other animals out there to the escape route." Rachel worked quickly to organize the animals, her veterinary experience helping her understand their different needs. The elk calf and other young animals were brought forward first, while the stronger creatures positioned themselves to help hold back the rising floodwaters that were now seeping under the barn's doors. Storm refused to leave his post by the weakened wall, Even as the mountain's rumbling grew louder, the stallion seemed to understand that if that wall failed before everyone was safe, none of their other efforts would matter. Sage joined him, the old gelding's quiet strength adding to their living buttress. As they pulled up the floorboards, they found Sarah's theory was correct. A narrow tunnel, shored up with old timber, led away from the barn toward higher ground. It wasn't large, but it was their only chance. Lucy's song rose again, not her usual lullaby, but something more urgent, a call to movement and survival. The animals responded to her voice, organizing themselves with remarkable efficiency. The wolves had come inside now, their wild instincts, telling them the mountain's threat was greater than any ancient rivalries. The first rumble of the actual landslide sounded like distant thunder. Debris began to hit the barn's roof. Small stones and soil at first, but growing larger. The timbers groaned under the impacts, and new cracks appeared in the already damaged walls. "The tunnel won't hold everyone at once," Ben warned. "We need to move in groups, but fast." Tom looked at Storm, still bracing the wall despite the increasing danger. The stallion met his gaze, and in those wild eyes, Tom saw something that moved him deeply. Not just courage, but absolute dedication to protecting this unlikely family that had formed in the heart of the storm. They began moving the animals. Through the tunnel, Lucy and James going first to help guide them up to safety. Emma waited at the tunnel's entrance, directing traffic with the calm efficiency she'd learned from years of managing excited children. Rachel worked alongside her, making sure the injured and exhausted animals got the help they needed. Sarah's horn sounded continuously now, its deep tones helping to keep the animals focused and calm despite their natural instincts to panic. The wolves had taken up positions around the tunnel entrance, helping to maintain order among the wild. Creatures that in any other circumstance would have been their prey. The mountain's slide was gaining momentum. Larger rocks crashed against the barn's walls, and the sound of splintering wood became constant. The floodwaters continued to rise, adding to the urgency of their evacuation. Hope supervised the movement of the younger animals, her gentle presence helping to keep them moving steadily through the tunnel. Star worked alongside her, his youthful energy helping to encourage the more hesitant creatures. The elk family posed a particular challenge. The bull's massive antlers barely cleared the tunnel's ceiling, and he initially balked at entering the confined space. But when his calf stumbled, nearly falling in the rising water, the great animal overcame his fear, following his family into the darkness. Through it all, Storm and Sage held their position, their bodies straining against the increasing pressure on the failing wall. The landslide was fully engaged now, tons of earth and rock flowing down the mountainside like a river of destruction. Time seemed to blur as they worked to evacuate their extraordinary congregation. Minutes felt like hours as each group of animals made their way to safety. The tunnel's old timbers creaked ominously under the weight of the mountain's movement, but somehow they held. Finally, only a handful of animals remained in the barn. The wolves went next, their wild dignity somehow enhanced by their willingness to trust in human guidance. Sarah's horn led them up towards safety, its voice never faltering despite her obvious exhaustion. "Storm, Sage, it's time," Tom called out. The wall they'd been supporting was buckling, the wood splitting under the relentless pressure. But the stallion didn't move. His eyes fixed on the humans still remaining in the barn. Rachel understood first. He won't leave until everyone else is safe. It's what herd leaders do. They protect their family. A massive impact rocked the barn, and part of the roof caved in. The remaining humans had no choice but to enter the tunnel. Tom was the last, turning back one final time to look at Storm. The stallion nickered softly, as if telling him to go on. The journey through the tunnel was a nightmare of close darkness and the sound of the mountain's fury above them. They could feel the earth shifting, hear the terrible groaning of stressed rock and soil. The old timber supports creaked and shed. dust but miraculously held. When they emerged on higher ground, the scene before them was extraordinary. The animals they'd helped escape were gathered in a natural hollow, sheltered from the worst of the storm. Lucy's voice rose in song once more, helping to keep them calm as they waited. But Storm and Sage hadn't emerged from the tunnel. The minutes stretched out painfully as they watched the barn being slowly crushed under the landslide's inexorable power. Hope grew restless, moving toward the tunnel entrance as if ready to go back for her companions. Then, just as Emma was holding Lucy back from trying to return through the tunnel, they heard it, the sound of hooves on packed earth. Storm and Sage burst from the tunnel's exit seconds before it collapsed behind them, their coats covered in dust, but their eyes bright with triumph. The stallion quickly moved to check on every member of his expanded family, touching noses with Hope and Star, gently nuzzling Lucy and James, acknowledging each of the wild creatures with his presence. Sage did the same, his quiet strength having proven just as valuable as Storm's dramatic leadership. The landslide continued its destructive path down the mountain, but they were safe on their higher ground. The wild animals, instead of dispersing, now that danger had passed, stayed close to the horses and humans who had helped them survive. The wolves maintained their protective circle, their earlier predatory nature transformed into something nobler. Sarah's horn sounded one final time, but now its voice carried a different message, not warning or guidance, but celebration of their shared survival. The elk calf pressed close to Lucy, while its mother watched with what seemed like gratitude. The other creatures settled in around them, creating a living barrier against the storm that still raged. But as they watched their barn slowly disappear, under the mountain's fury, a new challenge arose. They were alive but stranded on the mountainside in the heart of the worst storm in memory. Their supplies were buried, the temperature was dropping, and they had dozens of animals depending on them for guidance. The real test was just beginning, as nature seemed determined to push them beyond all normal limits of endurance and cooperation. Yet as Lucy's song rose once more into the storm-torn night, joined by the gentle sounds of all the creatures around them, they faced this new challenge, not as separate species, but as one unified family. The mountain hollow offered shelter from the wind, but the bitter cold penetrated to their bones. Huddled together on the exposed slope, the remarkable gathering of humans and animals faced their next challenge. The landslide had taken their barn, their supplies, and their sanctuary. Now they needed to find a way to survive until help could reach them. Storm paced the perimeter of their refuge, his breath creating white clouds in the frozen air. Despite his exhaustion and injured shoulder, the stallion remained vigilant. Every few minutes, he would pause to gaze down at the destruction below, as if trying to find a path through the chaos. "There's an old fire watcher's cabin near the ridge," Sarah said, her voice hoarse from hours of sounding the horn. "If it's still standing, it might give us shelter. But getting there." The challenge was immense. The cabin lay a mile up, the mountainside, through deep snow and treacherous terrain. Moving this many animals, including young and injured ones, seemed almost impossible. Yet staying in their current position wasn't an option. The temperature was dropping rapidly. Lucy pressed closer to Hope, sharing warmth with the white-blazed mare. The elk calf had curled up nearby, its mother standing protective watch. James sat with Sage, the old gelding using his body to shield the boy from the worst of the wind. The wolves had maintained their positions around the group's perimeter, occasionally exchanging glances with Storm as if coordinating their protective efforts. Rachel moved among the animals, checking for injuries and signs of hypothermia. "We need to keep moving," she said grimly. "The young ones especially. They won't survive long in this cold." Emma had been studying the ridge above them, her teachers, mind-analyzing the problem. "The animals made it down these slopes in the storm. They must know paths we can't see." As if in response to her words, Storm suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked forward intently. a new sound carried through the storm, the deep, resonant bellow of a bull elk, but not from their group. Somewhere up on the ridge, others of their kind were calling. The elk family with them responded immediately, their calls echoing across the mountainside. The wolves tilted their heads, listening intently, then looked to Storm as if waiting for his decision. The stallion's nostrils flared as he tested the wind, his wild instincts reading messages in the air that the humans could only guess at. "They're showing us the way," Lucy said softly, interpreting the animal's behavior with a child's clear insight. "The elk up there, they know the safe paths." Ben nodded slowly, his sheriff's experience with mountain rescue adding weight to his words. Animals have been navigating these slopes for generations. They'd know where the ground is most stable, where the snow bridges hold. Sarah raised her father's horn once more, but this time she played a different pattern. Not a warning or a call for help, but a request for guidance. The notes drifted up through the swirling snow, and after a moment, the elk on the ridge responded with increased urgency. Tom watched as Storm processed all of this information. The stallion's intelligence continued to amaze him. This wasn't just animal instinct at work, but genuine problem-solving. After a moment's consideration, Storm made his decision. He moved to the head of their group, nickering softly to Hope and Sage. The other horses responded immediately, helping to organize the various animals into a manageable formation. "He wants us to follow him," Mark said, recognizing the purpose. In Storm's movements, look how he's positioning everyone. Stronger animals on the outside, young ones protected in the middle. The wolves seemed to understand their role as well. They moved to flank the group, their sure-footed grace an asset in the treacherous conditions. The elk family took positions near the middle, their experience with mountain terrain making them natural guides for the less agile animals. Lucy's song rose once more, its melody altered slightly to match the rhythm of movement they would need. The animals responded to her voice, finding their places in the formation with remarkable cooperation. Even the most recently arrived creatures, who had joined them just before the landslide, fell into step with the others. Emma organized the humans with similar efficiency. Rachel, stay with the injured animals. Mark, Ben, help guide the stragglers. Sarah, keep that horn ready. We may need to signal for help. James, stay close to Sage. They began to move up the slope, following Storm's careful lead. The stallion chose each step with deliberate precision, testing the ground before allowing others to follow. When he encountered particularly treacherous spots, he would wait patiently while the wolves helped guide the other animals around them. The ascent was grueling. The wind drove snow and ice into their faces, while the steep terrain sapped their remaining strength. Yet somehow, the extraordinary procession continued to move upward. When younger animals tired, the stronger ones would help support them. When humans stumbled, the horses were there to steady them. Hope proved invaluable, her gentle nature helping to calm the more frightened creatures. Star, despite his youth, seemed to have found his calling as a messenger, moving up and down the line to check on stragglers. Sage maintained a steady presence. Near the middle, his experience providing stability for those around him. The elk on the ridge continued to call, their voices providing both guidance and encouragement. Sarah's horn would respond periodically, its deep tones helping to maintain their connection through the storm. The wolves' howls added another layer to this remarkable communication, creating a symphony of survival that echoed across the mountainside. As they climbed higher, something extraordinary began to happen. The animals' natural order began to shift even further. Predator and prey moved as one, each contributing their unique strengths to the group's survival. The wolves' keen senses helped detect hidden dangers, while the elk's sure-footedness showed others where to step. Lucy's voice never faltered, Though the cold made singing increasingly difficult, her song had become the heartbeat of their migration, helping to maintain their unity and purpose. The elk calf stayed close to her, as if drawing strength from her unwavering spirit. Time lost all meaning as they fought their way up the mountain. The storm continued its assault, but their shared body heat and determination created a bubble of warmth around them. When one member of their extraordinary family faltered, others would move to help, regardless of species or natural order. Finally, Storm paused on a small plateau, his head raised as he searched the swirling snow. Through the storm's veil, a dark shape gradually became visible, the firewatcher's cabin, somehow still standing against nature's fury. But even as hope rose in their hearts, a new sound cut through the storm, something that made Storm's ears prick forward sharply. This next challenge would test their newfound bonds in ways they couldn't imagine, forcing them to dig even deeper into their reserves of strength and trust. The night was far from over, and nature seemed determined to throw everything it had at this remarkable gathering of souls. Yet as Lucy's song rose once more into the darkness, joined by the voices of wolf and elk, horse and human, they faced the coming challenge not as separate species, but as one unified family, bound together by something stronger than storm or survival. The real test was about to begin, as the mountain held one final trial for this extraordinary congregation. But in that moment, watching the incredible scene before him, Tom knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, wild and tame, predator and prey, all united in their fight for survival. The mountain had one final challenge in store. As they approached the firewatcher's cabin, an ominous crack echoed through the night. The warming temperatures and constant rain had weakened a massive sheet of ice above them. And now, it was breaking free. Storm recognized the danger first, his sharp whinny cutting through the storm's fury. The ice sheet began to slide, threatening to cut off their path to safety. The cabin was tantalizingly close, but the approaching ice would trap them on the exposed mountainside if they couldn't reach it in time. Storm assessed the situation with remarkable speed, his wild intelligence processing their options. Lucy's voice rose in song, but this time it carried a new urgency. The animals responded instantly, reorganizing themselves with incredible efficiency. The strongest creatures moved to the front, while the wolves guided the younger and weaker ones into protected positions. "The cabin's our only chance," Ben called out, his voice barely carrying over the storm. "But that ice sheet will hit before we all make it." Tom watched as Storm made a decision that would forever change his understanding of what animals were capable of. The stallion moved to the head of their group, then did something extraordinary. He began to kick at the frozen ground, exposing the rocky surface beneath the snow. Hope seemed to understand immediately. She joined him, her hooves working to clear a path. Sage and Star followed suit, and soon the elk were helping as well, their powerful legs breaking through the ice crust. They weren't just creating a trail. They were building a barrier, using the exposed rocks and their own bodies to create a channel that might deflect the approaching ice. "They're making a break in the slope," Rachel realized, her veterinary knowledge helping her understand their strategy. If they can split the ice sheet's flow. There was no time to marvel at their ingenuity. Everyone who could help joined in the effort. The wolves took up positions along their makeshift barrier, their bodies adding to its strength. The elk family worked tirelessly, their experience with mountain terrain proving invaluable. Lucy continued to sing, her voice providing a rhythm for their desperate work. The elk calf stayed close to her, while James helped guide the smaller animals toward the cabin. Emma and Sarah worked to open the cabin's heavy door, knowing they would need to move quickly once the ice sheet hit. The crack of breaking ice grew louder, and Storm's ears pricked forward at a new sound, the rumble of the sheet beginning to move. They had seconds, maybe less. The stallion looked at their defensive line, then made another remarkable decision. He moved to a position slightly upslope where he could help direct the ice flow away from the others. Hope whinnied in protest, but Storm held his ground. The white-blazed mare seemed to understand that this was necessary, though she positioned herself where she could reach him quickly if needed. The other horses spread out along their barrier, ready to help deflect the ice. The sheet hit with tremendous force, but their preparation paid off. The makeshift channel they'd created split the flow, directing most of the ice around their position. Storm held steady against the initial impact, his powerful body becoming part of the barrier. The wolves braced themselves, their wild strength adding to the defense. What happened next would be told and retold in the valley for years to come. As a particularly large section of ice threatened to breach their barrier, the elk bull stepped forward, using his massive antlers to help break up the frozen mass. The wolves worked in perfect coordination with him, something that defied all natural order. Lucy's song never faltered, though tears froze on her cheeks as she watched these incredible creatures fighting to protect each other. The elk calf pressed close to her, while Star moved to help guide more animals toward the cabin. Emma and Sarah had the door open now, creating a warm haven for those who made it through. The ice sheet's passage seemed to last forever, though it was probably only minutes. When the last of it had moved past, leaving their barrier battered but intact, Storm was still standing. The stallion was covered in ice and snow, but his eyes were bright with triumph as he checked on every member of his expanded family. They moved quickly then, getting everyone into the cabin before another challenge could arise. The space was tight, but somehow they all fit, wild and domestic creatures arranging themselves with remarkable cooperation. The wolves took up positions near the door, while the elk family settled in a corner, their calf finally able to rest. Hope wouldn't leave Storm's side until Rachel had checked him for injuries. The stallion allowed the examination with patience, though his attention remained focused on ensuring everyone else was safe. Sage helped organize the other horses while Star seemed to take it upon himself to check on every animal in the cabin. As the storm raged outside, something extraordinary happened within those wooden walls. The natural order continued to shift and evolve. Predator and prey rested side by side, their ancient instincts transformed by what they had experienced together. The wolves became protectors, the elk became builders, and the horses became leaders of a family that transcended species. Lucy's song changed too, becoming a gentle lullaby that filled the cabin with peace. The animals responded to her voice, their breathing gradually synchronizing as exhaustion took over. Even the most recently arrived creatures who had joined them just before the landslide seemed to understand that they were part of something unprecedented. Sarah's horn hung silent now, its job done, but the deep bond it had helped forge remained, connecting all of them in ways that went beyond survival. Emma watched with tears in her eyes as James fell asleep, leaning against Sage, while the elk calf curled up next to Lucy. The storm began to ease as dawn approached, its fury spent at last. Through the cabin's windows, they could see the first hints of clearing sky. Help would come soon. The community would already be organizing search parties. But Tom knew that when they were found, it wouldn't be the end of this story. Storm stood at the cabin's window, his proud head held high as he watched the storm's retreat. In his wild eyes, Tom saw not just intelligence, but wisdom, an understanding that what had happened this night was only the beginning. These bonds they had formed, these barriers they had broken, would change everything. As the sun finally broke through the clouds, its light revealed a transformed landscape. The mountain had thrown everything it had at them: storm, flood, earthquake, and ice, but it had also given them something precious, an understanding that when survival is at stake, the divisions between species mean nothing compared to the strength found in unity. Lucy's song drifted into silence as she finally succumbed to sleep, but its echo remained in the peaceful breathing of their extraordinary family. Hope stood guard over her while Storm maintained his vigil at the window. Sage watched over James, and the wolves kept their protective circle unbroken. The elk bull and his family rested peacefully, their trust in their former predators now absolute. The morning light touched Storm's coat, making him glow like a creature from legend. The stallion turned to look at Tom, and in that moment, both man and horse knew that their lives had changed forever. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, something that would reshape their understanding of what was possible when all creatures chose to work together. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.